Hello and welcome back to Online AP Psychology Review. If you're new to us, I'm Dr. Swope. I teach at Northwest High School. And if you've been with us before, I promise I won't say, let's go Jags. Okay, so moving on. What are we going to talk about today? Well, we've got a couple of things on our to-do list. We've got kind of four major bullet points. The first one's a mouthful, discussing psychology's abiding interest in how heredity, environment, oh my goodness. All we're really going to talk about is how does genetics work to shape behavior and how did that come to be? Related to that is the second bullet point. Identify key research contributions of the scientist. Who are we talking about? And I can imagine you're going to know it's going to be Charles Darwin and maybe a guest appearance by William James. Number three is how to predict how traits and behavior can be selected for their adaptive value. And then the fourth one is we're going to start with the endocrine system and talk about how that makes us think and feel and affects our behavior. But before we get into today's stuff, let's jump back into what we did yesterday, where I left you off with. And again, it's my hope that you did take just a few minutes, jot down a few sentences. Can you or did you try to answer the three bullet points? Remember, you do as you practice. You do as you practice. And so the more you practice, the better you're going to do. So let's look at the first question of our three questions that we left you off with yesterday. Determine the median of the large bowl group. And first, we must arrange the set of scores in order. If you have a range of scores and you want to find the median, the first thing you have to do is put them in order. So, of course, I did that starting with the lowest at 258 and the highest at 245. Since it's an odd number of scores, we're going to take the middle one. And so we choose the middle number. So hopefully you got the median of 387. Okay, pretty easy stuff. Now we're going to go on to the the next bullet point. Which of the groups has the smaller range? And we'll remember that the range is the difference between the largest value and the smallest value in a given data set. So what we did was we compared in the large bowl, the highest value was 445. In the large bowl, the smallest value was 258. Well, the difference between them is 187. In the small bowl, of course, the highest value was 274 and the smallest value was 148. And so the difference there is 126. So going back to the question, which one had the smaller range? The small bowl did. Again, that's probably the easier side of the second bullet point, but there was a second part to the second bullet point. How does this relate to standard deviation? And again, the FRQs aren't necessarily going to ask you kind of these easier questions of do some quick subtraction. What they want you to do, again, define, apply, and add synonyms. So what we're going to do is we're going to go a little deeper and how does this relate to standard deviation? Well, the smaller the range, that means the closer the set of numbers is bunched around the mean, or there's the smaller it's spread out. That means the smaller the standard deviation will be. And if you can remember from yesterday, I had this picture in the video, and where you see two groups of data sets that are bunched around the mean, that's going to have a small standard deviation. Okay. The third one was to convert the frequency distribution that was presented, and here it is again, into a different type of chart. Now, again, I think I mentioned yesterday, this task was on an FRQ on the AP Psychology exam a few years ago. And I picked this question, not because I think people need, people like to draw, but because it forces you to think a little bit. It forces you to go back and say, okay, what is the independent variable? What type of independent variable it is? And how is it being measured? What is the dependent variable? So we chose a bar chart, and I hope you came up with a bar chart and not a histogram. And if you're unclear of what that is, go back and rewatch yesterday's video. It's a bar chart. Interesting. Why is that? Because it's nominal. It's categorical. These numbers, small or large, don't have a number associated with them. Remember, it's like chocolate or vanilla, not that one's better than the other. Well, of course, chocolate's better than vanilla. We all know that. But you get the idea that it's small or large. They're categories. The columns have nothing to do with each other. Therefore, they don't touch. So let's hope you came up with and correctly labeled the x-axis with the independent variable, bowl size, and the y-axis with the dependent variable, or the amount of pasta, or the mean amount of pasta between the small and large bowls. So I'm hoping that my explanation matched with what you came up with yesterday, or maybe even today as you prepared for today's video lesson. Okay, let's get into the bulk of today's stuff. Like I said, we have kind of 4 bullet points we're going to talk about. Okay, the first one is genetic instructions and the brain. And so here's an interesting, maybe rhetorical question or something to center us a little bit. If the brain accounts for us, what accounts for differences in brains between people? I mean, we all have, I guess, theoretically different hearts, but some hearts can be transplanted back and forth. And we all have, I guess, theoretically different blood, even though they fall into categories of blood types and we can have blood transplants. Could we have a brain transplant? And I'm not talking the science fiction-y, well, where would your personality be and stuff like that. I'm wondering, are our brains so different from each other that they just wouldn't work on a genetic or cellular level? So the interesting thing we want to look at here is about 30% of the genes are expressed, are reserved only for the brain. Okay, if we think of genes as little bits of instructions of how to build a human, when sperm hits egg, then 9 months after that, genes are being read and saying, well, how are we going to build this thing? How many arms should it have? How many legs should it have? How many hemispheres in the brain? How many lobes in each hemisphere? That kind of thing. Well, if we have about 24,000 genes, and I want to stress about, because this is a lot of science, and I think all science is kind of a moving picture. We're never going to be so sure of ourselves that we can't re-examine a fact or re-look at, look differently at certain ideas. So for right now, let's go with the estimate of 24,000 genes. So about 8,000 of them are reserved for how do we build a brain. Now, most of the genes are the same between people. If you think about it, most people, there's many more similarities than differences in people. When you're walking around, you don't oftentimes see a person with a random tail or a unicorn horn out of their head or 5 arms. So we all kind of follow the same genetic instructions. A very small percentage of our genes are different from other people, and that accounts for the differences. The different genes we have means that whatever's building us in our prenatal time, they're building us slightly different. And again, the emphasis on slightly different than other people. As I mentioned, we're using the word about 30%, about 24,000 genes. There's really actually still a debate on, what is a gene and how to label them. It's an ongoing science, much like psychology, much like all of the sciences. So things are constantly being looked at and evaluated. So I talked a lot on just this one slide alone, okay? But an interesting way to look at it is, let's use the metaphor that genes are blueprints for the human body and how it grows. And I don't know if you're a 16-year-old watching this, you might not have a lot of experience with construction of building a house or a large building, but you can imagine it starts with a blueprint. Someone draws up the plan of how to build this thing. So from day one of construction, not a lot, or maybe some of it goes to plan, but a lot of it might not go according to plan. There's adjustments made on the fly. Maybe something with the raw materials are different, or maybe someone has a better idea in the middle of building a house. So what does this metaphor mean? If yes, you have blueprints, but sometimes the blueprints aren't followed exactly. Well, that leads us to our next slides, and it's an interesting thing for you to be aware of, not just for this class and the upcoming AP psychology exam, but just general knowledge when you look at your life and other people's life. Genetics is not destiny. And by the way, philosophically, neither is the environment in which you're raised. Nothing determines what you're going to be. Genetics has an influence, but genetics is not destiny. And here's a word that we want to talk about. Genes and behavior are bidirectional. Or another way to say that is genes and environment are bidirectional. A lot of folks say, well, it's genetic. That's just how I am. I can't. Mm-mm. That's not necessarily what we're finding out. And the word of the day is going to be epigenetics. It's a newish type of science, a newest approach to biology and genetics, and it's the study of changes in gene expressions due from non-genetic causes. Now, think that through. Something that might occur outside of your brain, outside of your body, meaning the environment, what you learn, what you're exposed to, might. Now, I'm not going to say it's going to change the gene itself. What I'm going to say is it's going to change the gene expression. Or a more interesting way to say it is it's going to turn off or on certain genes. The one that might be that might work for things that you've seen before is, let's talk about serotonin. Now, Mrs. Fenton next week is going to go a little deeper into neuroanatomy and neurotransmission and neurotransmitters. But for right now, I think you might know that serotonin is the neurotransmitter associated with perhaps relaxation, a feeling of well-being or good mood or contentedness, among other things. Remember that neurotransmitters don't just do one thing. So there's a gene that's been identified, the 5-HTT gene, that is involved in the reuptake of serotonin. And we know reuptake is kind of like when the cell that released or burst out neurotransmitters across the gap, reuptake is when it sucks it back in. Well, if that gene is turned on or off, perhaps that's going to influence the amount of serotonin in between the cells. And if there's not a lot of serotonin, that's related to depression. Notice I didn't say caused. It's related to depression. So now we get the idea, if we've identified a gene that is related to a chemical that's related to depression, what does that mean? Does it mean perhaps in the future we can identify genes that are related to other maladies, or perhaps tweak things, turn them on or off? And the answer is probably yes, but it's a little too early to speculate on that science. Like I said before, epigenetics is the study of changes due to non-genetic causes. Okay, if we look at, a little strand of DNA right here, and then we start at the very beginning, prenatal. When sperm hits egg, the cells start to grow according to instructions. But environment, drugs, toxins, nutrition, or the mother's own stress level, that can turn on and off genes and thereby perhaps tweak how the growing fetus is going to grow, on which plans, maybe a contingency. Well, if this kind of stress, we better turn off this gene and turn on that gene. And that's called epigenetics. It continues after the baby's born, and it goes out theoretically through our whole life. Okay, so I think we got a good handle on what epigenetics is. There's an interesting bullet point here that there's less depression in collectivist societies. Okay, if you haven't heard that term, collectivist society is a society in which individuals are kind of raised. The value system is most people think of themselves more as part of a whole, part of a family group. And let's contrast that with the United States. The United States is not a very collectivist society. We're much more individualistic. When you're looking at your academic achievements, for instance, if not you, let's say an average student is going to look at how many AP credits they have, or what is their SAT score. And if they're proud of themselves, they're going to say, I did it. I did it. I was the one who stayed up late at night and doing things. Collectivist society would say we did it because it's the family that supported and contributed to the student's success, and it's the student's obligation to give back. So why am I bringing that up? Well, if there's less depression in a certain type of society, does that mean the environment might act on some mechanism on which genes might turn on and off certain metabolic processes? And that's the evidence. But go back, we don't have facts. It's very difficult to do an experiment on epigenetics. You can understand people don't live in a lab. As I said before, hinted at, hormones affect the expression of genes. Prenatal hormones and the mother's cortisol level might have an effect on how the baby grows. And we can't do experiments on humans, but we can on rats. So let's imagine that you have rats in a laboratory, and different researchers have stressed the rats periodically. And it's not nice to think about, but sometimes it's necessary. But of course, go back to your IRB. Is it okay to cause stress to rats? But if they cause stress, fear, anxiety to rats over and over and over, so the rats have reacted to this, and then you allow those rats who have been conditioned to have fear, if you allow them to breed, well, their offspring will then inherit some of those fearful traits. That's weird. Let's imagine right now you're 16 or 17 years old and you are learning something about AP psychology. You're learning a vocabulary word. And then many years down the road, you have your own child. Will your child, inherit the knowledge of that vocabulary? No, not of course not. But there does seem to be evidence that perhaps fear-based characteristics are transmitted through. And that is a fascinating idea. What does that mean for humankind? Okay, a word again that's worth knowing is called polygenic. And I think it makes sense. A trait that is caused by more than one gene. Okay. I said yesterday my least favorite phrase is research shows. Actually, that's not true. My least favorite phrase is when someone says I'm just saying after they said something. That's my first my least favorite thing. So my second least favorite saying is research shows. And periodically, you'll see in the popular media or on social media or a magazine, it says scientists have found. So, for instance, we have to be careful when we hear research shows scientists have found the gene for depression. Depression is a complex thing, and maybe there's many types of depressions. Um, Not everyone who has depression has the same symptoms. So if we were to say scientists have found the gene, I think that's a little bit false. It's a little way too simplified. Similarly, sometimes you hear amazing claims. Scientists have found the gene for obesity or creativity. When I think obesity is a complex interaction between behavior, how you were raised, your environment, hormones, neurotransmitters, and things like that. So we want to be aware that human beings are far more complex. Our behavior is far more complex than being able to be reduced down to one gene. So polygenic's that word. Okay. So how do we study this thing called genetic effects on development and on behavior? Remember, for the last couple of days, we talked about research methods. So, would it be appropriate to do a survey to study environmental effects on development or environmental effects on genetic expression? I don't think a survey is the right tool. A survey is a fantastic research method for certain research causes, but for this kind of thing, I'm not sure it's right. So, okay, let's do an experiment, right? If we want to find a cause, then there must be an experiment. Why? Because we control for all variables. So the way we would do this is get monozygotic twins. That's a fancy word for identical. Remember, when sperm hits egg, it forms a zygote. One monozygotic means one zygote. Sometimes later, within maybe the first 2 weeks, that zygote's going to split, and then we have identical twins. So let's take two monozygotic twins. That means we controlled for genetic variability, and we're going to raise them in different environments. We're going to raise one in a tough, neglectful environment, and we're going to raise one in a loving, kind, resource-rich environment. Well, you can imagine that is ethically horrendous. That's just evil to think about. So we can't do that kind of study. So how do we study environmental effects on genetic expression and development? We're going to rely on case studies. I mean, if we have billions of people in the world and 350 million people in the United States, it is possible to find two identical twins who, through accident or circumstance, not by purposeful design, were raised in raised in different environments. That is how we would study this kind of thing. Okay, we said a lot. Let's look at a quick check for understanding. The two main points for everything we've talked about so far is your genes are not your destiny. They can be turned on and off by the environment. Now, the exact mechanism isn't necessarily known. It's not like if you have a bad day, that's going to turn on and off genes. I think we're looking at sustained exposure to perhaps hormones or environment or something that is routine over a long period of time. And then, as we just talked about, most traits, especially behavioral traits, are polygenic. Is it possible that a very simple trait, such as eye color, is reducible down to one gene? That's more likely. But an idea like intelligence or mental illness is going to be far more complex. Many genes are involved. Okay, we're going to move into talking about some of the major contributors to the idea of heredity and environment. And that was our second bullet point, or second or third bullet point when we first started our lesson overview is identify key research contributions of scientists in the area of heredity and environment. So of course, we're going to talk about Darwin. Okay. Well, even though we have this little phrase from our kind of guiding curriculum, in my class and in other classes, people say, God, why is Darwin in a psychology curriculum? I mean, think about it. If Wilhelm Wundt, who we know is the father of psychology as a science because he set up the first laboratory, if Wundt set up his lab in 1879 and Darwin published Origin of Species in 1859, why are we talking about Darwin, who couldn't have been a psychologist because psychology didn't even exist until 20 years later? Well, there's a phrase in science that says, if I have seen further than others, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. So even though Wundt, quote, invented psychology or started psychology, he didn't just come up with it out of the blue. There were plenty of people whose work had influenced Wundt, and one of them, I don't think it was a direct line to Darwin. That's more for William James on the next slide, but you can get the idea of Wundt took the idea of psychology from previous ideas and previous work. Charles Darwin influenced psychology, and especially the psychologist William James. William James is known as the father of American psychology. And as you remember, Mrs. Fenton said, William James' famous quote is, the first psychology lecture he ever heard was the one he gave. So he kind of kicked off psychology in the United States. And so when we look at James's functionalism, he took the ideas of Darwin and the idea that everything has a purpose, or if you'll excuse me, everything has a function. So if you look at a cheetah skeleton, it's not by accident. It's designed to help the cheetah run very fast. If you look at a giraffe's neck, it's designed for a purpose. It's designed to reach the highest leaves. So nothing is by accident, according to this idea of evolution. So that means William James's idea of functionalism, all traits must serve an evolutionary purpose. Now, William James started the idea, and I know I'm getting off track, a little history here, but William James started the idea of consciousness. And he then asked, well, what is human consciousness? What function does it serve? And that's, maybe for a different chapter, but that's what William James said is everything for a purpose. First, we must have a caution. We can't see evolution. Okay, we just can't do it. Evolution is a process that happens over eons, just like we can't see thoughts. Remember, thoughts aren't observable. And some people say, yeah, they are. If we put someone in an fMRI machine and we can watch their brain be active as they think. Remember, that's studying blood flow. And just as we think we see evolution by looking at instincts, we're not watching evolution. We're not even watching an instinct. We're watching a behavior. Okay, and that's what makes this difficult to study. As we said, in humans, we can't see the cause of a trait or a behavior. Okay, unless you raise someone in a skin or a box, there's too many confounding variables to say what caused any individual or given behavior. In simple creatures, now spiders are interesting and creepy. If you see a spider, you can imagine, despite how creepy they are, the beauty and intricacy of a spider's web. How did it learn to do that? I mean, it's a marvel of engineering. And birds who can fly thousands of miles without getting lost. I don't know if they take trial runs or if they're taught that. I don't think they are. So if we look at spiders and birds and even a puppy who was raised without seeing another dog, which is a horrible way to raise a puppy, but if you raise a puppy and has never seen another dog, how does that puppy know to lift his leg? So in simple creatures, we can see instincts, but in humans, here's the problems, confounding variables. We have nurture, we have learning, we have a society. So it's difficult to see which behavior is purely caused by an instinct, by evolutionary processes. My challenge to you is, do humans have behaviors that are inherited? Okay. The immediate one is perhaps feeding, maybe drinking and breathing, lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy, if you can remember that. And, Mrs. Fenton and I will review that in the upcoming days and weeks. But I ask you, is feeding, drinking, and breathing, is it a behavior or is it a reflex? And maybe there's overlap there. But even the most basic behavior, breastfeeding, is actually something that's difficult for children. Perhaps there is a reflex to start, but they don't know how to do it. They've got to learn it. Similar to the idea of drinking, the first babies don't drink from a cup. And if I said breastfeeding is difficult and must be learned, human beings are far more complex than a spider or a bird who has these complex behaviors kind of imprinted or built into them. And maybe reflexes like facial expressions are behaviors that are instinctual. It's cute to note that babies who are born blind will still smile even though they've never seen seen a smile. So perhaps there are behaviors that are, as a result of instincts and genetic behavior, genetic material. So check for understanding there. The curriculum asked us to explore the link between evolutionary processes and behavior. In animals, it's easy to see. In human beings, not so much, because we have the confounding variables. And that's what you'd want to write on any FRQ. You're always looking to go deeper, not just defining a point, not just applying it, but demonstrating you understand the complex relationship between these concepts. Okay, now we're on the endocrine system. Um, Endocrine system is really, I'm going to sum it in for just a quick phrase, hormonal messengers that go between glands. Okay, so endocrine system is the system of hormones that are going through the bloodstream and attached to different parts of your body. Um, Next week, Mrs. Fenton, on Monday or perhaps Tuesday, we'll be talking about neurocommunication, tiny neurotransmitters that jump from synapse to synapse, but hormones go between glands. And let's try to compare them a little bit. If neural communication is the internet, then the endocrine system is snail mail. So I made a handy little table for us. So check this out. Neural communication is fast. Let me give you an example of what we call pre-conscious. Right now, take a deep breath, and I just want you to think of your phone number. Okay, give you a couple seconds. Hopefully it popped in your mind. Okay, now it easily popped in your mind. That's what pre-conscious is. It's an area of the mind where you store easily accessed information. Okay, now when I say go, I want you to think of your favorite color. Ready? Go. My question for you is, where did your phone number go? Notice how quickly your thoughts can change. Your brain is very, very fast. Now, on hormonal communication, in my class at this point in time, if we were in a classroom, I would, slam the board or slam the chalkboard or yell boo or slam the desk, and everyone startles. And then I would say, okay, you're startled, and I start the stopwatch. And then I ask them 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. How long does it take for the hormone adrenaline in your bloodstream to go back to a level of homeostasis? And it might take several minutes, in a quick class example. But if something you're really scared, it might take hours or sometimes even days for your hormones to restore to homeostasis. So hormonal communication is slow. Okay. And I just did a quick comparison. And I said in a slide or maybe a day or two ago, comparison's a key aspect of science and learning. We like charts, we like graphs. And it would be wonderful if we could have a chart of every neurotransmitter and every hormone and say, well, this hormone did that and this neurotransmitter did that. But, psychology is far more complex than that. We have, maybe 200 neurotransmitters, and they do multiple things, and they overlap and they interact with each other. Some are inhibitory, they turn neurons on, and some are inhibitory, they turn neurons off, and some are excitatory, they turn neurons on. So trying to put neurons and hormones in a box is very difficult to do. For instance, epinephrine is neurotransmitter. It's also a hormone. It's produced by the adrenal glands. Adrenaline's another name for epinephrine. It's produced by the adrenal glands, so it is a hormone, but it also exists in the brain as a neurotransmitter. So our task in psychology is really complex. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a periodic table where everything stayed in its little box and we could plug these information into formulas and say, aha, this equals genius, this equals creativity. But it's far more complex than that. And if you look at the middle bullet point, some hormones interact with receptor sites on dendrites. So some hormones can turn on and off neurons, and some neurotransmitters talk to glands. So while they are two different systems, the endocrine system and the nervous system, they do interact and overlap quite a bit. Okay, let's try to come together and look at a few interesting relationships, and that's going to be a hint for your upcoming homework and FRQ practice. We want to discuss the effect of the endocrine system on behavior, and again, that is really beyond the scope of not only a high school class, a college class, a grad class, because behavior is complex, and scientists, even the leading endocrinologists, If you said, well, what causes hunger? When you get down to it, they'll say, we just don't know. Similar to the idea, if I were to say, well, what causes something to appear on your screen, on your computer, you will say, I pressed a button. But, none of us really know the code, and we darn sure probably don't know the circuitry in the computer to make something happen. That's about the level of complexity you want to take away from this. So, this chart is not about memorizing vocabulary. And what I'm going to start talking about in a little bit is not about you furiously writing down notes. It's about the interaction. Yes, of course, you need to define many parts of the endocrine system, the hormones and the glands. But that's not enough to do well on an FRQ, as you know by now. So let's take a quick look at the hypothalamus, the interaction between just a couple things that I threw out here. Okay. Hypothalamus is a brain part. So why are we talking about it in a video lesson about the endocrine system? Well, the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. Okay. It used to be said, and it still is in some psych textbooks, that the pituitary gland is the master gland. And I'm not going to debate the accuracy of that. Some scientists say that's not true. Some scientists say it is true. But let's do this. The pituitary gland is involved with communicating quite a few other glands. So the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, it is top down. So the hypothalamus is kind of in charge of the pituitary gland, but you can imagine there's a feedback loop. The hypothalamus receives information. And if you remember from perhaps back in the fall, maybe back in September or October, your teacher introduced the hypothalamus is in charge of feeding, fleeing, fighting, and those kind of F words. We're looking at the idea of the hypothalamus is very related to hunger and anger. Okay. So if the hypothalamus is related to hunger, anger, and fear, well, how is the hypothalamus related to fear going to talk to, through the pituitary gland, talk to the adrenal glands? I'm going to make a bet with you. I don't think you can be scared without adrenaline. So, what comes first? Does adrenaline get released when you're startled, and then that goes to your bloodstream and tells your hypothalamus, oh my gosh, we're scared? Imagine I were to slam and make a boo noise and you startled. Were you scared because you're adrenaline, or were you scared because you thought? And that goes back, believe it or not, to William James. William James said, with his partner Carl Longa, that we are scared because of hormones. We're scared because of adrenaline. We're scared of behavior and environmental reactions, and that leads to feeling in the brain. Okay, notice that I'm talking a lot and I'm talking fast because I'll never be able to get through all of these parts of the endocrine system in our short time. But let me talk a little bit more about the concept of anger or fear. Two flip sides of a coin. Your hypothalamus deals with fighting and running away. So fighting and fleeing. Neither one of those can happen without your adrenal glands. Okay. Now, interestingly, if you're going to fight and be aggressive, your hypothalamus might, or your brain might sense injustice and say, hey, that's not fair. I'm mad. But to be aggressive in males, the testicles are going to produce testosterone, which has been linked. Now, I'm careful not to use the word cause aggression. Okay, because until you can do a study where you take 50 males and you inject them with, you get the idea. So if testosterone is linked or causes aggression, is it the hormone that causes someone to get mad? Or is it the thought that tells the gland to release the hormone? There's the interaction that I want you to be able to explain. Let's look at a hormone called ghrelin. Ghrelin's a hormone that is interrelated to the concept of hunger. The quick mnemonic is that ghrelin makes your stomach go grr, your stomach growl. Okay. So are you hungry because your hypothalamus said yes, or are you hungry because you have a hormone that says your stomach's empty? And the answer is yes to both of those. So we've talked about the interaction of testosterone on aggression. We've talked about ghrelin, which is a hunger hormone. Let's also talk about your pancreas and whether or not it notices that sugar in the blood sugar is low. If you have low blood sugar, you're going to be hungry. Well, that, of course, leads you to be hangry, as the commercial says, which brings up to your hypothalamus. Do you think you're hungry or do you feel you're hungry? Notice that I've given you a lot of rhetorical questions. I haven't necessarily told you this directly causes this, because the goal with this review is to have you be able to explain these relationships. Okay, with that in mind, with me kind of talking about these issues and how they're related, let's move on to our exam practice. We are back with the Schmidlap family. Freddie Schmidlap knows he needs to sit down and watch some AP review videos on YouTube that he missed. But if he is having trouble making himself do so, and I'm sure a lot of students and even some teachers, I can guarantee you, they know they have a to-do list and they're supposed to sit down and get it done, but they find a whole bunch of reasons not to do it. So let's get back to Freddie Schmidlap. But Freddie is having trouble making himself do so. When he tries, he feels nervous. He feels a little bit angry. And being a teenager, of course, he feels hungry. Explain how the following terms relate to Freddie's situation: epigenetics, hypothalamus, and pancreas. Again, we're looking at the SOTAS model. So my hint to you, and I urge you, number one, to sit down, whether it's right now or whether it's a little bit later, jot these down. Okay, make 3 distinct paragraphs. Remember spacing. Make 3 distinct paragraphs. What is epigenetics? How does it apply to Freddie Schmidlap? And go deeper and show that you really know a complex interaction between some of the stuff we talked about. Same thing with hypothalamus and same thing with pancreas. Again, it's not enough to define and apply. Go deeper, offer synonyms. Thanks for watching. We hope you will join us again. Be sure to complete the practice questions, and we'll review the answer in the next lesson.